and just as a precursor, maybe a warning for those of us who remain, the story that we're in this morning is going to be David and Bathsheba. So, if you are familiar with the content of that story, just know, be prepared, I guess I would say. So that's going to be in 2 Samuel. We're going to start in 10 and then get into 11. So if I can say David and Goliath, and we kind of all of a sudden kind of get a little stiffer stance and readiness to us, and like, yeah, let's go. Like David and Goliath, let's talk about it. I almost think when I say David and Bathsheba, it's almost maybe the opposite. Like, can we just skip this one? Like, let's move on. Let's see what's next. I don't think this gets any of us real excited necessarily to take life on and push forward per se. And yet, we are in this story more than we would wish to believe. So, you can be socially connected. You can be around a lot of people. And I would say even a practicing extrovert, okay? Extroverted person, and you're practicing your extrovertedness, and still be spiritually isolated. We went on a mission trip to Boston when we were in college. Sandy and I, we weren't married yet, but we were both on the trip. And it was astounding to us. One of the things that we noticed in difference in culture between Oklahoma and Boston, Massachusetts, there were people everywhere. I mean, subways packed full of people, streets, people walking up and down. And I don't know if I've seen more people around one another, more isolated from one another. I mean, very little interaction. And if you struck up a conversation and talked, it was kind of like, did you just speak to me? Like it was almost weird just to talk to each other. We can be in a setting like this often, even habitually, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but positive habit of coming to church, and still be spiritually isolated within ourselves. Imagine going to bed at night, and before you go to bed, you open up your front door and your back door. And then you go in your room, shut your room door, and lay down to go to sleep. What are you inviting in while you sleep? Maybe we do that during the day. Nice spring day, 75 degrees outside. You want the breeze to blow through. Open up the doors. I'm in the house. If something or someone comes in, I know about it. Okay? Dead of night. 3 o'clock in the morning. Hopefully, you're dead asleep. No idea what you're inviting in or who you're inviting in. So imagine my surprise in the middle of the night when I wake up to find the back door open and something in the house with me. And it's dark. I don't know what it is. I get elbowed from the kind lady sleeping next to me to wake up because there's something in the house. So I listen for a minute. Yes, that sounds like not you or I. So I reach over to my nightstand and unlock my safe, and I get my firearm out because you just don't know what you're up against in this situation. I walk out into our living room to find the back door wide open. Have you guys ever heard that song? The Day the Squirrel Went Berserk? In the First Self-Righteous Church? In that sleepy little town of Pascagoula? Well, that was my living room. And apparently we had invited a guest in for the evening, and he had started to make himself at home. And I come out to find him or her, I don't know. I wasn't going to ask the questions at the moment. We'll just call it him for the sake of the story. Nobody was paying attention. Doors left open. That's another story for another day. And the squirrel going berserk. Now, some of that story is true. It's not all true. But it's just like what happens in life. When we leave our doors open and we let our guard down and nobody else is watching our back, we open ourselves up to any number of things or people coming in and making themselves at home in our lives that do not belong there. So I'm not talking about squirrels or robbers, but I am talking about temptation and sin. When we live in isolation and we do not have anybody that is engaging in life with us, that is aware of what's going on in our lives, we might as well be leaving our doors wide open, putting a sign on the front door that says, "Come on in." Nobody's paying attention. That's where we find David in chapter 11. But it's interesting how he gets there. And that's in chapter 10. 2 Samuel chapter 10. David is king. These last couple of weeks, David's been riding high. Saul is dead. That whole regime is gone. There was a struggle there for a minute. David comes into power. He's walking in obedience with the Lord. Army is defeating the enemies as they're supposed to. David himself is not only experiencing the favor of the Lord, but he is engaged in worship. He is walking in obedience. We talked about last week, he is demonstrating grace and favor where it's not deserved. And we come to chapter 10 and we see some similarity there. The armies are out and they're at battle, but some of Israel's enemies that David had befriended and had a good relationship with Now those regimes and those leaders have passed on, and their son in particular from the Ammonites has become king, and he did not want to keep the same relationship with Israel and David that his father had. And so David had sent some men to Ammon, and the leader there, Hanun, is what I will call him. And they were not received well. We don't necessarily grasp this in our language, in our culture. But it says in verse 4, it says, "So Hanun took David's servants and shaved off half the beard of each and cut off their garments in the middle at their hips and sent them away." It seems weird, okay? I apologize, Tom, but as I scan the crowd, you're the biggest beard that I see at the moment. So picture Tom, or we could pick on Shane too, right across from each other. Either one, half their beard shaved off, or you could picture me since I'm staring at you. My beard's short, but whatever. Half beard shaved off. You walk around and you go down to Walmart like that, you might get a few sideways glances. Fair? Looks a little silly. Okay, you go like that to Walmart with a skirt cut off at your hips, probably get a few more sideways glances. Maybe people post a picture on social media, but your life isn't ruined per se, let's just say. Maybe a little embarrassed. How did your beard get shaved off, and what are you doing wearing a hip-high skirt? Fair questions. In this day and age, this was a sign of shame. I mean, growing your beard is an honorable thing to be able to do in Israel for Jews. And so to get half of that shaved off, and then to get your clothes cut off at the hips, guys, hips, right here, cut off at the hips. Shameful. Okay? So these are David's servants. What's the big deal? It's a reflection on David and his leadership as well. And the shame that is shown to the servants that David sent is the shame that is borne to David himself as king. It's hard for us to relate to this because we don't live in an honor-shame culture. Like, shame isn't unfamiliar to us, but it's not as important to us as it was to them. So we get confused when David says, hey, just stay there, don't come home yet, just stay there and let your beards grow back out, and then come home. Well, what is he doing? One, he's helping them to be able to save face some, so that they don't come home in a state of shame that they experienced in Ammon. But he's also helping himself save face some, so that he doesn't get shamed as the people see what happened to his servants. So David is experiencing public shame here in chapter 10. There's not a lot we could do about that. There's not a lot that he could do about that. It came. It's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to get past. So we see that shame brings isolation. Okay? This idea is not foreign to us. When we experience something that we think that everyone else knows, is our tendency to go out and live life among everybody as usual? No. Our tendency is to retreat and to fall back and to not talk about it, because if we don't mention it and we don't see people, we can pretend like it didn't happen. So we isolate ourselves. We isolate ourselves from people. We isolate ourselves at home. We isolate ourselves from the thought of what is shameful to us. And maybe there's something shameful that's not public, and we still isolate ourselves because we're not going to share what is shameful with others when we don't have to, because then we're going to bring shame on ourselves. We isolate ourselves. It's normal. It's human. It's not God's best for us, but it is normal. So when we see in chapter 11 and verse 1, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites. Why do you think David didn't want to go out to battle against the Ammonites? Because the Ammonites know the shame that's come upon David and Israel. David doesn't want to face that. He would rather stay at home. And so he isolates himself. You know what the opposite of isolation is? Vulnerability. We would rather not be vulnerable, generally speaking, even when shame isn't involved. I would say, and this may not be blanket for everyone, there may be exceptions to this. We are not a society that gives ourselves easily to vulnerability. Is that fair? Especially, just pick on guys for a minute, especially guys. We may not live in a shame-honor culture, but we do pursue our honor as men, and we do not want to look weak, generally speaking. We do not want to look out of control. We do not want to look like we can't handle something, because that would be weakness. Can't show weakness. We've got to maintain face. We can't be vulnerable. That is isolation. So we can't let anybody know the things that we're actually dealing with, the struggles that we're actually having, because what would they think of me if they knew I thought this or I did that? Vulnerability is risky. Because when you become vulnerable to somebody, you don't know how that's going to be reciprocated. And so we stay in isolation. You want to know one illustration of this for all of us, by and large, generally speaking? And there may be an exception to this if you live out in the country. But neighborhood living, you notice how nobody these days sits out on their front porch? Nobody, generally speaking, just walks around their neighborhood making conversation with people outside. We don't really do this anymore. I can remember a day growing up, we lived in a cul-de-sac in Bixby, Oklahoma. And we knew our neighbors. We could go outside and our neighbors may be sitting out on the front porch. Miss Debbie, Steve were on one side. Keith, and I can't remember Keith's wife's name at the moment. They lived next door to us. The McGills were across the street. The Moores on the end of the cul-de-sac. Like we knew our neighbors. We talked with them. The kids played together. But kids and adults, we would greet one another. We would say hi because we were out. Like this was just a normal thing. We could walk down the street and we saw some other neighbors in the neighborhood. It was just normal to be outside. And that was, in the 90s? And even then, it wasn't like before, back in maybe the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, when everybody sat out on their front porch. part of that was we didn't have cell phones, computers, internet, et cetera, to stay tucked away in our house and isolated. That's just the isolation that we live in. And you say, well, I live out in the country. I'm isolated anyway. Yeah, there's exceptions, yes. But let's just ask this. How many of you intentionally live out in the country so that you don't have to be around people and you can stay isolated from others? Nothing against that. That's not sinful in itself, but it just means that you've got to work harder to be in connection with people, because that is part of taking the gospel, fulfilling the Great Commission of going and baptizing and sharing and training others to know and follow what Jesus taught. Shame brings isolation. You know what? Isolation enhances temptation. Isolation is like a petri dish for temptation. Okay, here's what I mean. We did this experiment when I was in school. I was not particularly a science person in this way. Anyway, I don't need to go into that. Petri dish, right? You put some sort of bacteria or something in this dish, and it has a jelly, right? You take that dish, you could leave it out in room temperature, you could expose it to heat, you could put it in refrigeration, right? And you could watch how either slow or quickly that bacteria grew, and you could see the signs of it based on the environment that it was in, right? Cold, we put things in refrigeration because bacteria tends to grow slower in cold. Isolation is like a petri dish for temptation. It's like a warm room temperature petri dish. It just grows. Why? Because when I'm isolated and people don't know the things that I'm thinking and the things that I'm doing, I don't have to answer to anyone. Those temptations, whether I give in or don't give in, nobody will know because I'm isolated. And so I don't have to fight against them because nobody's going to know if I don't. And so temptation comes. And it's just like what happens to David. David is home when kings are supposed to be at battle. It happened late one afternoon, toward the evening time, when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house. Okay, this is fairly normal. Middle East, it's warm during the day. When the sun is out, it's warm. They don't have air conditioning, right? So when the breeze comes through in the evening and the sun goes down, you need to cool off a little bit. You go out on the roof. You take a walk. You let that breeze blow through and cool you down. Well, it just happened that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful. Had David sinned yet? No. Got a guy. I know, ladies, I know there's all of you here too. Got a guy. You see a woman bathing. The implication is she has no clothes on. And he could tell, however near or far, that she's beautiful. It's not a sin. He didn't put her there. The problem comes when he continues pacing on the balcony, looking at the woman bathing that's beautiful. He didn't divert his gaze. He didn't say, I have a handful of wives, more than I can handle already. I don't need to look at somebody else. I'll just head back in until I think she might be done. Probably what he should have done. Okay? At this point, David's lingered. His gaze has lingered. He's looking at somebody. He may not know who this is yet, but he's he's at the very least, he's flirting with temptation. Probably he's given full bore into lust because he's not done anything about it yet, and he doesn't want to. Side note, we're vulnerable in isolation. We're also vulnerable in times in our life of struggle. And this is not a guy thing, it is a guy, girl, it is a people thing. When we're struggling with anxiety, when we're struggling with stress, when we're struggling with just difficult circumstances of life, our tendency is to look to an outlet for those difficulties. And usually, it's not a healthy outlet unless we've developed habits toward that, or unless we've built some parameters around ourselves to bring some people in to help us build walls to keep us from finding unhealthy outlets for those seasons. David clearly doesn't have that in this moment, because the next thing that David does, David sent and inquired about the woman. So not only did David not go back inside, not only did David not stop looking, not only did he keep looking, but then he took action based on the temptation that was in front of him. He couldn't leave it at that. He had to go and inquire about who this is and what was going on, and could this be somebody that should belong in the palace with me? David sent and inquired, and one said, "Isn't that Uriah and Bathsheba's house? Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" David. You know who that is. Come on. So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him. Now pause here. I don't know why. I don't know what our motivation is in this. We have tended to whitewash this account in Scripture. We talk about this as if it's adultery. Bathsheba was bathing in front of the king. She dangled that bait out there. David took the bait, invited her in. That's not what this says. Bathsheba was bathing ritually, not seductively. What she was doing was ritual. Not going to go into that for the moment. Well, just read it. Verse 4. David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now, parentheses. She had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Okay, this was monthly bathing that she would do as a result of the law, purifying her uncleanness once a month. Leave it there. So this was not like, I'm out putting on a show for the king. This was, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And you did it outside because it's cool outside. Anybody want to be sweaty when you get out of the bathtub? What's worse than being hot and sweaty, taking a shower, getting out, and being hot and sweaty still? This is no good. So David sins, and his servants take her and bring her. They didn't invite her. They didn't pick her up on her way to the palace. They take her and bring her to David. This is not consensual. This is not adultery. This is, you don't have the opportunity to say no to the king. Whether it's spoken or unspoken, you did not say no to the king. If you said no to the king, it could, it may not certainly, but it could cost you your life. Coming to the king's presence was not like going over to you and I's house. It was not a, hey, are you free on Saturday night to come over and have dinner with us? It was a, you drop what you're doing and you come because your presence is required of you by your king. And she's not escorted into the front room of the palace. She's escorted into David's private quarters. This is not adultery. This is not consensual engagement. In our day and age, not then, because the standards were different, in our day and age, David could be arrested on charges of rape. Now, I'm going to guess that you're probably like me, and you've probably not heard this from the pulpit in a church. I had always considered this from the angle of adultery, David and Bathsheba. When I first considered otherwise, I was skeptical at best. Why don't we want to see things this way? Let's start with this. When the news is talking about a rapist on the news, in our day and age today, what's our point of view on that? I've heard a number of different things, just side comments at various times in life from different people. I've heard things said like, bring back the firing squad. Doesn't even need to be a trial, just put him to death. I hope that he gets what he deserves when he goes to prison. These sorts of comments. Is that, anybody heard something similar? I'm not asking if you've said something similar, I'm just asking if you've heard. Let's just pretend like it's heard. Okay? So here in Scripture is David, part of the lineage of Jesus, the receiver of promises of God that bring about Jesus, a person who is labeled a man after God's own heart. And if we look at David as a rapist, our view of David changes. Is that fair? I don't know that there's any other way that we should look at David. And here's what happens, okay? Isolation enhances temptation. David faces this temptation. David acts on the temptation. David carries the temptation as far as he wants to. There was nobody around David that was going to tell him no. There was nobody around David that was going to stop him. David, you really shouldn't do... None of his servants said, David, you probably shouldn't invite her back to the palace. None of his servants said, no, we're not going to go bring her. That's somebody else's wife. Nobody said that. In isolation, it just breeds temptation, and then eventually sin captivates us when we befriend temptation. I heard this illustration, and I think it's phenomenal. I wish I came up with it. When we treat temptation this way, it's like we bring a pet lion home, and we dote on that lion. We pet its mane. We lay it down in the living room, and when people come over, after they get over the fact that there's a lion in your living room, we're like, man, isn't it pretty? Like, it's beautiful. Look at this lion. It's majestic. Like, you can't look at a lion and not be in awe of the king of beasts. And it's beautiful. You keep the lion, you pet the lion, you feed the lion. The lion's your pet. You take it on walks around the neighborhood. Nobody else goes with you because you're walking a lion, but it's your lion. It's pretty. And then one day, the lion does what lions do. And it turns on you. And it devours you. Because that's what lions do. It's the king of the jungle for a reason. It's not a pet. And when you bring it home and you invite it in and you care for it and you leave it next to you, eventually that lion is going to be a lion. It's not a kitty cat. And it turns on you as lions do. And we think that when we invite temptation in, and we treat temptation like our pet, and we fail to put it out, and we pet it, and we feed it, it's not going to turn on us? No. Temptation, when it is fully grown, gives way to sin, and sin devours. That's what sin does. And then we're going, I had this temptation, and I had cared for it for so long, and then all of a sudden it turned on me. And we act surprised as if the temptation, the sin came out of nowhere. It didn't. David was where he was not supposed to be. He was isolated. He faced temptation, which in and of itself is not sin, but he befriended that temptation, and that temptation grew, and he acted on it, and it became sin. And then it turned into a monster. Because then the woman conceived. And she sent and told David, I am pregnant. And this is a problem because her husband is off fighting with the army. And in the time frame that she and David were together, it cannot be Uriah's. There's no mistaking. Now David is in a problem. The king has gotten somebody else's wife pregnant. And you can't hide it. I mean, you could hide it for a short while, but you can't hide it for a long while. So what does he do? He does what we all do with our sin. We've got to keep it secret. So we've got to figure out a way that other people don't find out about it. So David brings Uriah home. He's like, hey, go spend some time with your wife. She's probably lonely. You've been off at battle. Like, you guys need some you time. You go home. And you know what Uriah does? He's an upstanding guy. His dudes are fighting a battle. And he's like, I'm not going to go sleep in my own bed, sleep with my wife while all these guys are off at battle and they can't be with their wives. So he sleeps outside. He doesn't even go in his house. And David's going, oh, crud. That didn't work. Now what can I do? So he comes up with his plan. Okay. He calls Joab, general in the field. All right, send Uriah to the front lines when the fighting is heavy. Tell everybody to back off. Take a step back. Leave him on his own. He was killed in battle. Couldn't do anything. He was killed in battle. He's trying to save face. He's trying to figure out a way to cover up his sin so that he doesn't have to own up to it. Anybody? You've lived in isolation. You've befriended temptation. Temptation has given birth to sin. Sin has begun to devour you. If I'm not careful, this is going to come out. I've got to keep it under wraps. And so secrecy just requires more sin to cover up the sin that's already there. And so we keep piling it on and piling it on. And we can't tell somebody about it because we can't be vulnerable with anybody because we're isolated. And I can't let anybody in now. So what are they going to think of me? Sin, especially in secret, leads to more sin. David covers his sin up by having Bathsheba's husband killed because he couldn't find another way out of it. Maybe he gets away with it until God's prophet shows up at his doorstep and makes him realize, I don't know how many other people know, but I'm telling you, God's told me about it, and this is a problem. Now, I jumped ahead on that a little bit. Here's what I want us to understand. We live in isolation. Temptation is ours every day. When we live in isolation, we make ourselves vulnerable in the way of opening your front door and your back door and falling asleep in your bed at night. And we just invite all of that to come in. Come what may, come in. There's nobody on guard and on watch. Make yourself at home. And then we're surprised when we wake up in the middle of the night to a squirrel or something worse making its home in our life. How did we get to this point? I want to tell you, God will deal with our sin. He will deal with it. In His goodness, He will deal with it. It doesn't feel like His goodness. It is His goodness. Because God is upright. Because He is without sin. And for Him to overlook sin and not address it is not good. In the same way that letting a murderer off in trial by a judge is not good. Or any other crime. If a judge just goes, probably didn't do it, free to go. It's not good. Maybe the only person it's good for is the one who's on trial for the crime. Everyone else is not good. The Lord will deal with our sin. So here's what I know. When I say that, every single one of us, whether you realize it or not, every single one of us at this moment has sin that we have hidden away inside, that we do not want to be vulnerable with anyone. I'd rather not tell anyone. And when I say the Lord will deal with our sin, all of a sudden that shame comes. Because the enemy says, he's right. God will deal with your sin. So you better not let anybody find out about it. It's not going to go well for you. What Jesus says is, yes, I took your sin on me. And it's why I went to the cross. And the cross was grotesque because it is the wrath of God poured out on me, Jesus, for your sin. So that the Lord could look past you and me in our sin, and He might see that sin laid upon His Son, who would stand in our place and absorb our wrath, so that we don't have to stay in the place of shame that our sin wants to put us. Unlike David in this moment, David finds the Jesus out of this. But in this moment, all of the weight of his sin rests on him. God will deal with our sin, and he has dealt with our sin. The question is, do we pay for it, or did Jesus? Because if you don't trust that Jesus did, and that God will take all of what's coming to you for your sin and me for my sin, and put that on Jesus, then that's coming for you. But God offers restoration. God offers reconciliation, a repair. God offers renewal. If you would confess, if you would trust him, he is going to look at you, not in the shame that you see, but through the Jesus-shaped silhouette that stands between you and him. And the righteousness that was earned by Christ is wrapped around you like a blanket and covers you through faith in him. So God will deal with your sin. He will not overlook it. But the question is he going to deal with it in Jesus and offer you righteousness? Or is he going to deal directly with you? And that is not what you or I want. Shame is not a place where we have to stay. Shame is a place that Jesus brings us out of. So the question is, let me just say what the question isn't. The question is not, do you have shame? The question is not, do you have sin? The question is not, have you faced temptation? The question is, will God deal on your behalf with all of those things in Jesus, or will he deal with you directly? And the longer that you sit on it, the offer is always there. The longer that you sit on it, the more possible it is that you stay sitting on it and that it never comes to Jesus. Guys, we have to be vulnerable in our lives. Maybe not with every single person. We need some people in our lives that we can be vulnerable with so we never get to the point where David was. We're always going to struggle with temptation, but it doesn't have to give way to sin that gets covered up by more sin. But we can't stay isolated by ourselves. So are you willing to become vulnerable with some? And are you willing to trust your sin and your shame to the goodness of God and the payment made by Jesus on your behalf?